Mark will be preaching this morning out of John chapter 20, verses 24 through 31. I will be reading from the ESV. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
There's a book called Deeper, and we're actually asking the small groups to go through this book starting in the fall. It'll start next late August or early September. It's by Dane Ortland. But he says this about Jesus. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he named the inhabitants Indians. He thought he had reached what Europeans of the time referred to as the Indies, which was China, Japan, and India. In fact, he was nowhere close to South or East Asia. In his path were vast regions of land unexplored and uncharted, of which Columbus knew nothing. He assumed the world was smaller than it was. And this is his commentary. Have we made a similar mistake with regard to Jesus Christ? Are there vast tracts of who he is, according to biblical revelation, that are unexplored? Have we unintentionally reduced him to manageable, predictable proportions? Have we been looking at a junior varsity, decaffeinated, one-dimensional Jesus of our own making, thinking we're looking at the real Jesus? Have we snorkeled into the shallows, thinking we've now hit bottom on the Pacific? People talk about Jesus constantly. They ascribe to him many things. I see it on Facebook all the time. People rebuking others in Jesus' name. They use him to defend their own positions. They say what he was and what he wasn't. They can't all be right. So if you're not a follower of Jesus this morning, I wonder which of the many versions of Jesus you have rejected. And if you are a follower of Jesus, I wonder what version of Jesus are you following? So for Thomas, the Jesus he thought he had been following wasn't the real Jesus at all. So I want us to look at two things from this passage about Thomas and about Jesus. Number one, from belief to unbelief, and number two, from unbelief to belief. This is very simple. From belief to unbelief, and then number two, unbelief to belief. I get it, right? The first one's belief, and we end at belief, and the unbeliefs are in the middle. All right. First one, from belief to unbelief. I need something here. Kleenex. I've got stuff going on here. You probably don't want to know about that, though. From belief to unbelief. So we don't know that much about Thomas. Here we go. It's not what you think it is. It's just an itch. And I didn't want to stick my finger up my nose, because that wouldn't look good, the pastor on Easter Sunday doing that. Doesn't look good when he even says that. So my wife's going to die. I will be hearing about this later. All right. So we don't know much about Thomas. There's really only three things that he says or 3 places that we know about him. He's listed with all the disciples in every single list that in all the Gospels. So he's always there. But besides this story that we have here in John, we have 2 other instances where he says something. So Jesus knew that there were death threats against him before he had come to Jerusalem. And now he finds out that his good friend Lazarus is sick. He does not go to him right away, but he lets Lazarus actually die first because he had something he was going to show them. And then he says to the disciples, let's go to him. And the disciples know that it's dangerous because Lazarus and his sisters Martha and Mary live in Bethany, which is only really about 2 miles to the east of Jerusalem. I mean, it's right there. And so it would be dangerous for them because the chief priests are looking to kill Jesus. And so when he says, let's go, we have a saying from Thomas. And Thomas says, let us also go that we may die with him. I don't think we have any idea what that means, except that he was kind of courageous. My guess is he didn't really think they would die with Jesus. Jesus had too much power, but he was going to be the one who stood up. At any rate, most of the commentators think that he always looked at life from the dark side. He was kind of a pessimist, but I don't know if that's true either. But when they get to Bethany, of course, Jesus surprised them all and he raises Lazarus from the dead. That must have been amazing. They were fearful to go there, and Jesus does this with power. Surely nobody's going to touch Jesus. He has all power. He is always surprising them. And then I can only imagine what Thomas was feeling when Jesus got on that donkey that day and he went down the hill with the crowds waving and saying Hosanna in the highest and waving the palm branches, throwing down their cloaks for him. He must have thought, we're there. Jesus is going to take over with his power. He's raising people from the dead. He's healing people. He's providing food. He's going to come in and he's going to decimate the Romans. But a few days later, they celebrate the Passover. And it's the second place we hear about Thomas. Jesus began to tell them that he was going to go away. And they're all confused by this. He said he's going to prepare a place for them. And he tells them, you know where I'm going. And they're like, what? They don't have any idea. And Thomas responds. This is the second time we hear about Thomas. In John 14, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? And then Jesus says the famous words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Maybe he's getting an inkling that not everything is as it seems. There they are doing the Passover together. And then the unthinkable happens. Jesus is arrested, he's tried, he's abused, he's crucified, and what seems very apparent to me is that Thomas is rethinking this whole thing about Jesus. They were all devastated, of course, and I'm sure Thomas was one of them. So why do I say that he was devastated? Well, Mary Magdalene, on the first day of the week, she came to report to the disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead. And the disciples that very day, later on in the day, gathered together. But guess who was not there? Thomas was not there. He was not there. I can't help but think that after the crucifixion, his devastation was so deep that it wasn't just a disappointment. It might have even been a feeling duped, that he had given his life to this for 3 years and suddenly it's over. But this was never in the game plan. To lose Jesus wasn't in the game plan. So fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I'm not getting duped by this again. So he doesn't go to the meeting with the disciples. And his unbelief is complete. I really believe that. This is actually what happens when people get disappointed with God. The Jesus they thought they knew turns out to actually be a sham, and so they begin to question everything. In some cases, people completely abandon the faith. The popular term used today is to deconstruct your faith. They begin to question everything. And deconstruction often happens when something hard hits and there's anger towards God, or there's deep disappointment, or this isn't what I expected. There's doubt about the faith. I knew someone close who, when they got colon cancer, commented, "I have served God faithfully all these years. Why would he give me colon cancer?" What Jesus was she following? So this is a misunderstanding of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And this is exactly what happened to Thomas. After that meeting that Thomas did not attend, the text tells us that the disciples came to him and said, "We have seen the Lord." Even with these brothers who he had done life with for 3 years, they had been together with Jesus for 3 years, going all over Judea and Galilee, and he still doesn't believe them. He doesn't want to get duped again. He says to them in verse 25, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Talk about cynicism. I'm sure it was driven by heartbreak and by anger. It didn't turn out the way he wanted. He'd forgotten all about the miracles, especially the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which probably had happened not more than a month before. We don't know exactly the timeline, but it wasn't a long time before that he raised Lazarus from the dead. See, it's so easy, brothers and sisters, to pigeonhole Jesus into our preconceived notions of him. And it's clouded by our cultural reality, our family reality, the hurts and disappointments of our lives, and so many other criteria. But here's my question for you this morning. If you're an unbeliever here, are you sure that the Jesus you might have rejected is the real Jesus? And if you're a follower of Christ this morning, are you sure that the Jesus that you say you are following is the real Jesus? Or is it something you've made up? Is it a figment of your imagination? See, the real Jesus can't be put into a box. And he asks us to follow him, even at the cost of ourselves, even in the midst of sacrifice and suffering. This is what he calls us to do. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. This is the call of the real Jesus. He asks us to follow him no matter what circumstances may come. I watched an interview this week of Helen Roseveare. It's an old video. She's been gone for a while now. She'd been a missionary doctor in the Congo back in the 1960s. And she labored to build a hospital, and then she worked in the hospital. Then she moved somewhere else and built another hospital and labored she worked there helping people, help heal the sick, caring for people, and ministry was tough. People were not really responding to the gospel message. Then some rebels took over the country. Many of the Westerners left, but she stayed. Eventually, the rebels made it to her town and they took her prisoner. She endured beatings and she was brutally, sexually assaulted. She was sure that her life was over, but during that awful ordeal, she kept hearing the Lord say to her, "Can you thank me for trusting you with this experience, even if I never tell you why?" And when she prayed that prayer, she felt overwhelming joy in spite of her circumstances. Why? Oh, it's such a paradox. You give up yourself, and he gives abundantly of the fruit of his Spirit, and you're filled with joy, and you're filled with peace. This is the way this works. A giving up of ourselves. It's hard in America. We have too much. We're way too comfortable to do that. From belief to unbelief. But number two, from unbelief to belief. So Thomas does not believe, but he does agree to go with the disciples to their next meeting, which is 1 week later. The reason might have been because of their they may have talked him into it. The intimate relationship he had with them, or perhaps there was still a glimmer of hope that what everyone was saying was true. He might have had that little glimmer of hope. We don't know. We just know that he was there a week later. It says in verse 26, 8 days later, and no, it's not a typo. They counted the day. So if it was Sunday to Sunday, they counted the first Sunday and the last Sunday. So it was 8 days, but in our thinking it's 7 days, but it's a week. So 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." His first comment is, "Peace be with you." This is actually what the real Jesus brings. He brings peace. He brings joy too, but he brings peace. So when you give your life to Jesus and you say to him, "You be in charge, do with me whatever you want," if you don't feel peace, maybe you're not following the right Jesus. Maybe it's a Jesus you've made up in your mind, and there's a million of them out there. Did you know that my Jesus agrees with me on every single political issue I think about? Every one. But notice the grace of Jesus as he says to Thomas and to the rest, "Peace be with you." How can he say that to Thomas, who had flat out didn't believe him? Didn't believe he had risen. He said it to Peter too, who had denied him 3 times. Jesus comes into the room and says, "Peace be with you." Jesus has been through hell, literally. He had conflict for 3 years, and it reached a fever pitch just a week before. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane and sweat drops of blood, not because he was wondering what might happen to him, but because he absolutely knew what would happen to him. And his biggest dread was that he would be separated from his Father. And that's actually what hell is. And he got a glimpse of it in the garden, and he sweat drops of blood. And then they took him and they tortured him and beat him and crucified him. And yes, his Father forsook him on the cross while he suffered hell for you and for me. The Father, just to get it straight, he wasn't angry at the Son. It's not like there's an angry Father and a loving Son. No, the Father poured out his wrath on his Son whom he loved for our sakes, because he loved us. He loved us. And he made Jesus pay in our place. This is the love of the Father and the love of the Son. So when Jesus says, "Peace be with you," it doesn't come from ignorance or a pie in the sky wish that it might be true. When Jesus came in there and said, "Peace be with you," he actually went to the cross so that it would be absolutely true. And here he is with the disciples, and now Thomas is with them. But wait, Thomas had seen Jesus die. He had seen his lifeless body. He knew that they had put him in the tomb. His world had crashed down, and God had not intervened for 10 long days. He'd been devastated. And then the disciples were saying that they had seen him. No way, he wasn't going to believe it. But then Jesus shows up. He shows up. Then he said to Thomas in verse 27, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." What does Thomas realize when he sees Jesus? He realizes it's all true. It's all true. Everything Jesus said was true. He had conquered death and sin and Satan, and the future was assured. See, this is what happens when you see Jesus. You realize that your circumstances are just that. They're temporary circumstances, but that your future is assured. When Jesus sent his disciples out to do ministry all over Judea, and they came back and they'd seen Satan falling from heaven. They'd had tremendous success. And Jesus says, don't put your hope in that. Put your hope in the fact that your names are written in heaven. See, this is the future that's assured. This is why peace can come even in very, very hard circumstances. Jesus has won the victory. And then we get what is the climax of the entire book of John. And I just want to go through John very briefly for you. I want you to see this, how this becomes the climax, this next phrase that comes from Thomas. So from the very beginning of the book, John is making the argument that Jesus is God. The very first verse, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is referring to Jesus. And in chapter 1, we find out that for the most part, the world had rejected Jesus. The darkness did not want the light. They didn't want it. And then you get the rest of the book where John is proving who Jesus is. Do you remember way back in the book of Exodus, when Moses was standing before the burning bush? It was a bush that wouldn't go out. And it wouldn't go out because God was in the bush. And he was asking Moses to go to Egypt and free his people. And Moses said, who should I say is sending me? And God says to him, I am that I am. Now, if you take those words, I am, and you go to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was in Hebrew, the Greek translation, the words are ego eimi, I am. John is full of that. Listen to it. He says this, I am, let me find it and we'll be good. Here it is. I am the bread of life. Ego eimi. I am the light of the world. Ego eimi. Ego eimi, the door. Ego eimi, the good shepherd. Ego eimi, the resurrection and the life. Ego eimi, the way, the truth and the life. Ego eimi, I am the true vine. And then he's talking with the Pharisees. He's arguing with the Pharisees. And he says to them, Abraham would have loved to have seen my day. And they scoff at him and say, you're not 50 years old yet. And you say you've seen Abraham. And then he says to them, before Abraham was, ego eimi. I am that I am. And then he's in the garden. And this whole group of soldiers, maybe as many as 100 soldiers, come and they say to him, are you Jesus of Nazareth? And what does he say? Ego eimi, I am. And you know what happens? They all fall on the ground. The power of God himself in human form. And then we come to this verse. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. So the climax of the book of John, it's the point. He's the Lord of all. He's the God of very God. He's equal with the Father and the Spirit of the same substance. 3 persons, 1 God. The reason that we know all of this is true, do you know how we know that? Do you know what one of the biggest proofs is? It's these disciples who went out and they gave witness to Jesus for the rest of their lives. Most of them gave their lives up as martyrs. They went out with great joy. They went out with peace in their hearts because they knew this was true. They had seen the resurrected Christ. If you're an unbeliever here, I want to say to you that there's such compelling proof that Jesus was raised from the dead. It explains, it's the best explanation that we have for why the church grew like it grew. But to all of you, I want to say this. Which Jesus have you been following? Pastor Scott Sauls, in one of the Easter blogs, in one of his Easter blogs, he's had one every day for the last few days. He says this: kings and conquerors have always known how to make an entrance. Julius Caesar returned to Rome with parades and power displays, legions of soldiers trailing behind him. His procession was a carefully constructed warning. Don't challenge the man who holds the sword. Jesus, by contrast, arrived with gentleness. He was a strength not advertised with spectacle, but cloaked in humility. His entrance fulfilled the words of the prophet Zechariah. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. Charles Spurgeon once observed of this moment, he stoops to conquer. And truly that is what Jesus was doing, offering a kingdom where meekness disarms might and where glory comes through surrender. The people wanted a liberator to defeat their enemies with force. Jesus came to deliver them through mercy, not vengeance. His mission was rooted in sacrificial love, not political revolt. His throne would be a cross, and his crown would draw blood. His own blood was shed, and John tells us what the entire purpose of the book is. But these are written in verse 31 that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. See, John wrote this gospel long after Jesus had died and risen and ascended to his Father. He was still just as convinced that Jesus was alive as when he had been with him. And this is the question that everyone in the world needs to answer. What are you going to do with this Jesus? Is it about power? Or is it about losing myself so I can follow him wherever he wants to lead me? Wherever. How great would it be if some of our young people grew up and felt called to the mission field? Perhaps we might have a martyr among us. We may think that's terrible, but it's not, because the future is assured. Jesus has died and he rose again. If you know who he really is, there's no middle of the road. You either reject him outright and don't claim to follow him, or you fall on your knees and you declare, my Lord and my God. If the resurrection is true, then he truly is Lord and God, and he's worth following with every fiber of our being. For those who fall on their knees and say, your will, not mine, those are the people that he just floods with his peace. That's the real Jesus, and that's the gospel. And the gospel changes everything. Let's pray.